Hello, church. I want you to know that I'm grateful for you as we continue on throughout this COVID-19 pandemic that continues to affect us. I am grateful for you and for the communications that I have with you. So here we are. I just wanted to give you an update, just a message, kind of an add-on to the sermon that we had this past week about family worship. I hope it's a help, a suggestion, if it's of any use to you. We talked about on Sunday how there are three basic things that are involved in family worship: reading scripture, prayer, and singing. There wasn't enough time in the sermon to add any additional things, and so I thought that I'd add it here in a more conversational context. This is what I'm about to suggest is an add-on, so it's an option, something for you to consider. And that's called a catechism, is what I'm going to suggest. A catechism. And maybe some of you don't know what a catechism is. What a catechism is, it comes from the Greek word katekeo, which means to teach or to instruct. And we see throughout the scripture, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, that it is our responsibility, both as individuals and as leaders, whether you're a leader in a church or in your family or wherever God has placed you, it's also your responsibility to teach others and to receive instruction as well. And a catechism, what it is it is a systematic question and answer format which summarizes biblical doctrine, biblical knowledge, which is foundational to our lives as Christians. And so you may have heard the word used in more of an ancient sort of setting, and you think back to the 1500s, 1600s, something like that. And certainly they were used greatly in those times. In fact, it was a regular practice to catechize your children. That was the process where you teach your children the questions and the answers so that your children would grow up knowing the basics of biblical doctrine. Not just for an academic knowledge, but a very practical knowledge. And so what many of you maybe have heard of is the Westminster Catechism, Shorter Catechism, and that is a classic. It's a good one. It's orthodox. I have it here. And just to give you an example, maybe to boost your memories, you've probably heard the question asked before, what is the chief end of man? Well, that's the first question out of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, and the answer is, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. So that's an example. It's a question with an answer, and the point is that you're to memorize them. Now, the Westminster Shorter Catechism is good, but it's not really necessarily Baptist-friendly. It tends to be used more by Presbyterians and those in Reformed circles. There are Baptist catechisms as well, and I'll recommend one there to you, but I want to bring to your particular attention one that's really new and fresh. It was published in partnership with the Gospel Coalition and Timothy Keller. You probably know that name. He's written a number of books. He worked on this project. It's called the New City Catechism. And just like the catechisms that are centuries old, it brings to bear theology summarized in a question and answer format that helps us to understand the basics. Now, you might be wondering, well, why do we need this? Isn't it good enough just to read Scripture? Well, certainly it is. But what we find today is that many Christians simply do not have the basics of the faith. And we see this particularly in youth. If you work with youth in youth groups, Sunday schools, what we often hear and see is that, you know what, youth just don't have the basics anymore. Talk about Adam and Eve, and they don't know who those people are. Here we are trying to teach youth the gospel and that Jesus saves us from sin when the youth don't know what sin is. Well, and in order to understand what sin is, you need to connect that ultimately to God. So you need to know who God is. And if you don't know that, then the gospel doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so the catechism is a foundational way to help change that. For example, in the New City Catechism, question number 2 is the question, what is God? That's a big question. but it can also be summed up in a sentence or two. And the answer to that question is God is the creator and sustainer of everyone and everything. He is eternal, infinite, and unchangeable in his power and perfection, goodness and glory, wisdom, justice, and truth. Nothing happens except through him and by his will. You might think that that's a pretty long explanation. That wouldn't be a good thing to teach your children. Well, one of the good things about this catechism is it comes with a little book designed for children. And so it'll ask that same question, but with a much more condensed answer. For example, what is God? Answer, God is the creator of everyone and everything. You see? So it's one of the good things about this catechism is that they have essentially one for adults and one for children. Same questions in the same order, but the answers are a little bit longer or shorter, more simplistic or more complex, depending on who the audience is. And I'm sure maybe even some of you who are not children might like the children version of it too. Another good thing about this catechism is it gives scripture to help back up the answer. So, for example, in the section, question number 2, what is God? After the answer, you see the scripture from Psalm 86, which says this, there is none like you among the gods, O Lord, nor are there any works like yours. All the nations you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and shall glorify your name. For you are great and do wondrous things. You alone are God, but you, O Lord, are a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. That's just one of many, many sections of Scripture throughout the entire Bible that talk about who God is. And so it's helpful to have a catechism which summarizes these big questions in simple statements that we can learn and memorize. Question 6, for example, how can we glorify God? Answer, we glorify God by enjoying him, loving him, trusting him, and by obeying his will, commands, and law. And it goes, there's all kinds of, question 16, what is sin? That's a big question, isn't it? What is sin? But sin is summarized here in one sentence. Sin is rejecting or ignoring God in the world he created, rebelling against him by living without reference to him, not being or doing what he requires in his law, resulting in our death and the disintegration of all creation. Again, you think, well, gee, that's a really long answer, perhaps. Actually, it's not, considering all things involved in that question. But if you want the really short version for the kids, what is sin? Sin is rejecting or ignoring God in the world he created, not being or doing what he requires in his law. A little bit more simple there. So I mention this to you simply because I think that this is a really good tool. In fact, I've thought about using it or incorporating it into a formal study for youth, either here in the church or in the community. I would suggest that, especially if you have children in the house, that you would use something like this. It teaches them the foundational truths of Scripture. And there's many anecdotes and stories that can be said. Some are included in the introduction to the Catechism there, the New City Catechism, as to why it's so important and some of the impacts that it has had on youth. So that's what I find. One of the big things we see in the church today is simply a lack of biblical knowledge, a lack of theological understanding. And again, theology impacts our daily lives and our actions as it relates to God. So it's important to know theology. And the Catechism is one helpful tool for that. You could also Google a Baptist Catechism by John Piper. He adapted it from a 1689 Baptist Catechism, and he kind of just updated it. And it more follows the Westminster Shorter Catechism, if you're more aware of that one or like the model of that one. It's 108 questions, whereas this is only 52. And it's, like I say, the one by John Piper is Baptist friendly. So that is an added thing that you can do in your family worship or in your own personal study. Again, you're supposed to memorize these. Ultimately, you get to the point where anyone could ask you this question, and you should be able to have a condensed and yet sufficient response to that question. And I think it would help you as well in in being confident in being able to answer the questions that you never know may be posed to you by either people in your community or your own children. So I hope that's helpful to you. I'm always looking for different tools and helps that can help you as well as me know God better and His Word. So I pray that you have a good week this week coming. If you have any questions about any of these tools or anything else, you just let me know. Be happy to help. All right, we'll see you now.